The Curse of Mermaid Island. The night was pitch black as Captain Blackheart's ship, the vengeful Spectre, sliced through the inky waters of the Caribbean. The crew, a mix of the living and the undead, moved silently about the deck, their eyes hollow, their souls long consumed by the curse of their captain. Blackheart stood at the helm, his eyes fixed on the distant outline of an island shrouded in fog. "Mermaid Island," he muttered, a wicked smile curling his lips. "The source of our immortality and the doom of many." The vengeful spectre cut its way through the dense fog, finally coming to a halt in the shallow, eerily calm waters surrounding Mermaid Island. The ship's anchor splashed into the dark water, and the silence that followed was almost palpable. The crew, both living and undead, lowered the rowboats with practiced efficiency, the oars slicing through the water with ghostly precision. Captain Blackheart stood at the bow, his eyes fixed on the island. The moonlight glinted off his sword, a cruel smile playing at his lips. He knew the power that lay hidden on this cursed isle, and he was determined to claim it. As the rowboats reached the shore, the crew disembarked, their boots sinking into the soft, wet sand. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves, a deceptively peaceful rhythm that belied the horrors lurking just beyond the tree line. The beach stretched out before them, a desolate expanse of sand and skeletal remains. Bones, bleached white by the relentless sun, lay scattered across the beach like grotesque relics of a forgotten battle. Skulls grinned up at them from the sand, their empty eye sockets a silent warning to any who dared to trespass. The air was thick with the scent of salt and decay, a pungent reminder of the countless souls who had perished here. Captain Blackheart motioned for his men to follow, and they moved inland, their lanterns casting flickering, ghostly light on the twisted trees and vines that surrounded them. The foliage was dense and unwelcoming, the gnarled branches and thick underbrush seeming to close in around them with every step. The trees, ancient and towering, twisted their limbs in unnatural shapes, resembling tortured souls reaching out in desperation. Thick vines hung from the branches like nooses, swaying gently in the breeze as if beckoning the intruders deeper into the island's heart. The crew's lanterns threw eerie shadows on the forest floor, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. The further they ventured, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, and an unnatural stillness settled over the island. The silence was absolute, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl, adding to the sense of foreboding that gripped the crew. Each step felt heavier, the path ahead growing darker and more treacherous. The men exchanged uneasy glances, their resolve wavering in the face of the island's malevolent presence. Captain Blackheart, however, remained undeterred. His eyes gleamed with a fanatical light, driven by a hunger for the power he believed lay hidden in the island's depths. After what felt like an eternity of trudging through the dense undergrowth, the crew finally emerged into a clearing. Before them lay a large, murky lagoon, its waters glowing with an otherworldly light that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. The lagoon's surface was unnaturally still, reflecting the moonlight in a shimmering, eerie tableau. Captain Blackheart stepped forward, his breath visible in the cold air. "This is it," he whispered, his voice tinged with both awe and anticipation, "the source of our immortality." The crew gathered at the edge of the lagoon, their lanterns casting long shadows over the water. The sense of dread intensified, the very air seeming to hum with dark energy. They knew they were on the brink of something both wondrous and terrifying, the culmination of their captain's relentless quest for power. As they stood there, mesmerized by the unnatural glow of the lagoon, the water began to churn, and the haunting, melodic voices of the mermaids filled the air. The men readied themselves, knowing that the true horror of Mermaid Island was about to be unveiled. The eerie tranquility of the island was shattered, and the crew braced for the onslaught of supernatural terror that awaited them. In the heart of Mermaid Island, hidden away from the prying eyes of the world, lay a large, murky lagoon. The waters of the lagoon glowed with an unnatural, ethereal light, that seemed to come from the depths themselves. The glow cast an eerie luminescence on the surrounding foliage, making the twisted trees and vines look like ghostly sentinels guarding a forbidden treasure. Captain Blackheart's eyes gleamed with unbridled greed as he approached the water's edge. The light reflected off his eyes, giving him an almost demonic appearance. "This is it," he said, his voice a hushed whisper filled with anticipation. "The source of our power." The crew, both living and undead, stood behind him, their expressions a mixture of awe and trepidation. They had heard the legends of Mermaid Island, of the untold riches and the dark curse that came with them, but none had ever seen the source of the island's malevolent energy. As they gazed into the glowing waters, a sudden, unsettling calm fell over the lagoon. The air grew colder, and the men could see their breath misting in front of them. The silence was broken by a faint ripple that spread across the lagoon, growing in intensity with each passing second. The water began to churn violently, as if something monstrous was stirring from the depths. The men stepped back, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. The once still lagoon now roiled with energy, waves crashing against the shore in a frenzied dance. From the depths of the lagoon, a chorus of haunting melodic voices began to rise. The sound was beautiful, yet terrifying, a song that seemed to come from another world. It filled the air, wrapping around the men like a seductive, inescapable fog. The voices were enchanting, drawing them closer despite the terror that gnawed at their hearts. The water's surface broke, and the mermaids emerged, their forms slowly rising from the depths. Their beauty was otherworldly, their bodies sleek and graceful, covered in shimmering scales that glinted like precious gems in the moonlight. Their hair flowed like silk, cascading over their shoulders in waves of iridescent color. As the mermaids emerged fully from the water, their eyes became visible, cold, dead eyes that belied their stunning beauty. There was no warmth, no humanity in their gaze, only an insatiable hunger. Their mouths curved into cruel, predatory smiles, revealing rows of sharp, glistening teeth. The mermaids moved with an unnatural grace, their bodies undulating as they floated just above the surface of the lagoon. Their voices continued to weave a hypnotic spell, luring the men closer, despite the primal fear that screamed at them to run. Captain Blackheart stood transfixed, his greed overcoming his fear. He stepped forward, his hand reaching out as if to touch the nearest mermaid. "This is our destiny," he muttered, more to himself than to his crew. "The power of the mermaids will be ours." One of the mermaids, more striking and sinister than the rest, glided towards Blackheart. Her eyes locked onto his, and he felt a strange, magnetic pull. She reached out with delicate webbed fingers, her touch icy cold as it brushed against his skin. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. The air was filled with the haunting melody, the lagoon's glow reflecting in the captain's eyes. But then, in an instant, the illusion shattered. The mermaid's smile twisted into a snarl, and she lunged forward with lightning speed. Her claws, sharp and deadly, slashed across Blackheart's chest, tearing through flesh and fabric with ease. Blood sprayed into the air, the rich metallic scent mixing with the salty tang of the sea. Blackheart staggered back, his hand clutching his chest as he fell to his knees. The other mermaids attacked the crew with a savage ferocity, their melodic voices now replaced by guttural growls and hisses. The lagoon transformed into a battleground, the once calm waters now churning with blood and violence. Jonas, a burly member of the crew, was the first to fall. A mermaid's claws ripped through his chest, tearing out his still beating heart in a spray of crimson. His body collapsed into the water, where the mermaids tore it apart with a frenzy born of hunger and rage. Thomas, another crew member, screamed as he was dragged into the lagoon, the water quickly turning red with his blood. The mermaids surrounded him, their teeth and claws ripping into his flesh, his screams echoing across the island before being abruptly silenced. The remaining crew fought desperately, but they were no match for the supernatural speed and strength of the mermaids. One by one, they were pulled into the water, their bodies torn and mangled beyond recognition. Captain Blackheart, barely clinging to life, watched as his men were slaughtered. The Mermaid Queen, her eyes glowing with malevolent delight, approached him slowly, savoring his fear. She leaned in close, her breath cold against his skin. "Your soul is ours, Captain," she whispered, her voice a mix of seduction and malice. With a final brutal swipe, she plunged her claws into his chest, ripping out his heart. Blackheart's vision faded to black as the world around him dissolved into a sea of blood and screams. As the last of the crew's screams faded into the night, the lagoon grew still once more. The mermaids, their hunger temporarily sated, slipped back into the depths, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. The beach was littered with the remains of Captain Blackheart and his crew, their bodies a grim testament to the island's curse. The legend of Mermaid Island grew darker, a tale of greed, supernatural vengeance, and the eternal hunger of the damned. The crew of the vengeful spectre stood at the edge of the glowing lagoon, mesmerized by the beauty of the mermaids and the enchanting song that filled the air. But the tranquility was shattered in an instant. The mermaids, their eyes flashing with predatory intent, moved with supernatural speed, launching themselves at the crew with a ferocity that defied belief. Their movements were a blur, their claws slicing through the air with deadly precision. The men barely had time to react before the first blow was struck. Jonas, a burly and seasoned sailor, was the first to fall. A mermaid, her scales shimmering with an eerie light, lunged at him with terrifying speed. Her claws, razor-sharp and glinting in the moonlight, tore through his chest with a sickening crunch. Blood sprayed across the sand, the rich metallic scent mingling with the salty sea air. Jonas's eyes widened in shock and agony as the mermaid's claws dug deeper, her grip tightening around his heart. With a savage jerk, she ripped it free from his chest, the still-beating organ held aloft in her blood-soaked hand. The sight was both horrifying and mesmerizing, the heart pulsing for a few seconds before going still. Jonas's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, his blood pooling around him in a dark, glistening puddle. Panic erupted among the crew. They drew their weapons, slashing and stabbing at the mermaids with a mix of desperation and terror. But the mermaids were relentless, their supernatural strength and speed making them nearly invincible. The crew's weapons seemed to pass through their ethereal forms, causing little to no harm. Thomas, a wiry sailor with quick reflexes, managed to land a blow on one of the mermaids, but it only seemed to anger her. She turned on him with a snarl, her eyes blazing with fury. In a flash, she was upon him, her claws raking across his torso. Thomas screamed as his flesh was torn open, blood gushing from the deep wounds. The mermaid wrapped her arms around him, her grip like iron, and dragged him towards the water. His screams grew louder, more frantic, as he was pulled into the lagoon. The water quickly turned crimson with his blood, the once glowing surface now a horrifying blend of red and black. The remaining crew members fought with all their might, but they were no match for the mermaid's otherworldly power. One by one they fell to the relentless onslaught. Their screams of pain and terror filled the air, mingling with the haunting melody of the mermaid's song. Another sailor, Richard, found himself cornered by two mermaids. He swung his cutlass wildly, but they dodged his blows with ease. One mermaid slashed at his legs, bringing him to his knees, while the other grabbed his head, twisting it with a brutal snap. His neck broke with a sickening crunch, and his body fell limply to the ground, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. The lagoon was now a scene of unimaginable horror. The water, once glowing with an ethereal light, was stained with the blood of the fallen sailors. Limbs and entrails floated on the surface, a grisly testament to the brutality of the mermaids' attack. The mermaids moved through the carnage with a macabre grace, their eyes cold and unfeeling. They tore into the bodies of the fallen, feasting on the flesh with savage delight. The air was filled with the sounds of tearing flesh, cracking bones, and the mermaid's haunting melodic laughter. Captain Blackheart, mortally wounded and barely clinging to life, watched in horror as his crew was decimated. The Mermaid Queen, her form more terrifying and majestic than the others, approached him slowly, savoring the moment. Her eyes locked onto his, and he felt a wave of dread wash over him. The Queen leaned in close, her breath cold against his skin. "You sought power and immortality, Captain," she whispered, her voice a chilling blend of seduction and malice. "Now, you will pay the price." With a final brutal swipe, she plunged her claws into his chest, ripping out his heart. Blackheart's vision blurred, and his body convulsed as his life ebbed away. The last thing he saw was the Mermaid Queen holding his heart, her eyes filled with triumphant malice. As the last of the crew's screams faded into the night, the lagoon grew still once more. The mermaids, their hunger temporarily sated, slipped back into the depths, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable horror. The beach was littered with the remains of Captain Blackheart and his crew, their bodies a grim testament to the island's curse. The legend of Mermaid Island grew darker, a tale of greed, supernatural vengeance, and the eternal hunger of the damned. Captain Blackheart stood at the edge of the lagoon, his face a mask of horror and fascination as he watched his crew being torn apart by the merciless mermaids. Blood soaked the sandy shore and stained the waters of the lagoon, creating a ghastly tableau of death and destruction. The air was thick with the coppery scent of blood and the chilling sounds of tearing flesh and dying screams. Despite the chaos, Blackheart could not tear his eyes away from the scene. His heart pounded in his chest, a mix of fear and a twisted sense of awe. The power of the mermaids was undeniable, a force both beautiful and terrible. He had sought this power, had longed for it, and now he was witnessing its full, horrifying potential. Amidst the carnage, Blackheart's gaze was drawn to the center of the lagoon. The Mermaid Queen, her form rising from the churning waters, commanded his full attention. Her eyes, glowing with a dark, ancient hatred, locked onto his. There was an intensity in her gaze that spoke of centuries of rage and vengeance, a depth of malice that chilled him to his core. As she moved towards him, her body began to shift and change. Her once beautiful form twisted into something monstrous. Her scales darkened and her limbs elongated, ending in razor-sharp claws. Her teeth, now bared in a vicious snarl, gleamed like daggers in the moonlight. Captain Blackheart, driven by a mix of defiance and desperation, raised his sword, the blade gleaming with cold steel. His voice, usually commanding and filled with authority, trembled as he shouted, "Stay back, demon!" But the Queen was too quick. With a speed that defied comprehension, she lunged at him. Her claws raked across his face, leaving deep, bloody gashes that burned with an otherworldly fire. The force of the blow sent him stumbling backward, his vision blurring as blood poured from the wounds. Blackheart fell to one knee, his strength draining away. The pain was excruciating, but it was the cold, creeping sensation of his life ebbing away that filled him with true terror. The Queen's laughter, a chilling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoed in his ears. As he struggled to rise, Blackheart looked up and saw the Queen standing over him, her eyes filled with triumphant malice. Her claws, dripping with his blood, glinted in the moonlight. She leaned in close, her breath cold against his skin, and whispered, "Your greed has led you to this, Captain. Now, you will pay the price." With a brutal, almost casual motion, she plunged her claws into his chest. Blackheart gasped, his eyes widening in shock and agony as he felt her hand wrap around his heart. The pain was unimaginable, a searing, all-consuming fire that tore through his body. The Queen's eyes never left his as she ripped his heart from his chest with brutal efficiency. Blood sprayed from the wound, splattering her face and chest. Blackheart's body convulsed, his mouth opening in a silent scream as his life force was violently torn from him. His heart, still beating weakly, was held aloft by the Queen. Blackheart's vision dimmed, the world around him fading to black. The last thing he saw was the Queen's triumphant smile, her teeth glinting in the blood-soaked moonlight. As Blackheart's lifeless body crumpled to the ground, the Queen tossed his heart into the lagoon. The waters churned and bubbled as if alive, consuming the heart and drawing the blood into its depths. The air grew still, the eerie calm returning to the island. The mermaids, their hunger temporarily sated, began to retreat into the lagoon. Their melodic voices returned, now a haunting requiem for the souls they had claimed. The once beautiful beach was now a grisly scene of death and destruction, littered with the mangled remains of Blackheart's crew. The legend of Captain Blackheart and Mermaid Island grew darker with each passing year, a tale of greed, supernatural vengeance, and the eternal hunger of the damned. The vengeful spectre, now devoid of its captain and crew, remained anchored off the island, a ghost ship forever cursed to wander the seas, a chilling reminder of the horrors that lay hidden in the depths of Mermaid Island. The vengeful spectre remained anchored off Mermaid Island, its deck silent and empty. The island itself seemed to pulse with a newfound energy, the mermaids returning to the lagoon, their hunger sated for now. As dawn broke, the beach was littered with the remains of Blackheart's crew, their bodies torn and mangled, a gruesome testament to the island's curse. The legend of Mermaid Island grew darker with each passing year, a tale of greed, horror, and the eternal hunger of the damned.
If you enjoyed our extended audio storytelling, please give us a like and share. Also, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to get more of Dr. Mortis Cadaver's collections. Your support helps us continue to bring you the most chilling and thrilling tales from the depths of Dr. Mortis Cadaver's vault. Thank you for listening, and remember, the darkness is always waiting, just around the corner.